Hi, this is David with David's Tutorials. In today's video, I'm going to tell you about flight training school for the Air Force. It's called Undergraduate Pilot Training, and it's abbreviated, as is the case with many things in military, UPT. I'm going to give you in this video an overview of most of what went on during pilot training. It's only going to be a very shallow look at it, and please understand, it's been more than 50 years since I went through pilot training, and so other people may remember it differently. I may be misremembering it, or they may have changed it since then. So if anybody has any input on that, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section down below and let me know the way you remember it. Let's get started. When I finished officer training school in San Antonio, Texas, it was the end of June 1969, and I had a date at the pilot training class of 7102 at Laredo Air Force Base in Texas, but it didn't start until near the end of September. So that was the end of June. I had all of July and all of August and much of September before my pilot training class started. Well, I didn't really have anywhere else I wanted to go, and I didn't have a lot of leave built up, so I couldn't really take leave. So I just went ahead and drove on down to Laredo, Texas, and checked in at the Air Force Base. And of course, they had to find something for me to do during the two and a half months until my pilot training class started. And I was thinking, well, gee, they might go ahead and stick me in one of the other classes so I could start a head start and get going on that, but they didn't. They put me in the T-37 squadron and let me talk on the radio to the T-37 instructor pilots and the trainees that were going out to training areas. Now, it turns out that when you go up for flying training, you have a specific area you have to go to, and each one that calls in and says they would like to go to a training area, the dispatcher, who was me at that time, had to assign them an area, and they would report into the area, and they would report when they got out of the area. And that was actually a very interesting time for me. I learned the T-37 squadrons. I met the squadron commander. I learned radio procedures. I learned what training areas were. I learned their boundaries, their altitude limits, and I just had a pretty good time doing that. Eventually, it came time for my pilot training class to start, and we got started. Now, there were several phases to pilot training. There's the flying phases, which came in 3 phases for the T-41, the T-37, and the T-38, and there was the academic and practical training sessions, and the academic sessions were conducted in classrooms, and in these classrooms they would teach you such things as aerodynamics and avionics and meteorology. That means weather, for those of you who didn't know what that meant, and I bet you most of you did. And you would just go through all these classes and learn a lot about such things as the way a jet engine worked or the aerodynamics of flight. For example, you may know, or you may not, that there are 4 forces acting on an airplane in flight. There's gravity, which wants to pull it down to the earth, and there's lift, which wants to pull it up away from the earth. And there's propulsion, or motivation, and that's when the power plant of the airplane moves it forward, and there's aerodynamic drag, which wants to pull it back. Those are the main forces that work on an airplane in flight. Another thing we learn, for example, is that when an airplane is in level flight, the wings produce a certain I would say footprint, but it's really a wing print on the ground, and the area of that wing print produces a certain amount of lift, and in level flight, that amount of lift balances exactly the pull of gravity on the weight of the airplane. Now, when the airplane rolls into a bank so it can turn, the wing print on the ground decreases, which decreases the amount of lift. However, the weight of the airplane remains the same, so the force of gravity is the same. So when the amount of lift produced by the wing decreases, you have to pull back on the control stick so as to increase the amount of lift on the airplane to counteract that loss by the decrease in wing. And the more you bank, the more you decrease your wing print on the ground, so the more you had to pull back on the stick, to the point that if you go into 60 degrees of bank, you had to pull back on that stick so hard that you're producing 2 G's of downward force. Now, you are banking with the airplane, so when you pull back on the stick and you produce a G force, you're being pushed straight down into the seat, and that's coordinated flight. These are the sorts of things we learned in classes. Now, T-41 training. The T-41 was basically a Cessna 172 painted Air Force gray with the Air Force emblem, letters on the side of it, and it had the Air Force flash, and it had a tail number, and it only had 2 seats for the pilot and the co-pilot, and it's basically a Cessna 172, and that was where we all learned our basic flying skills. Now, flying skills as a very first time flyer, sometimes people get airsick. Now we had, I think, about 32 flights in the T-41. Like I said, it's been 50 years. I don't remember that specifically, but it was about that number. Of those 32 flights, I got airsick on about 28 of them. Now, if the Air Force wasn't in such dire need of pilots in 1969 and 1970, they might have kicked me out of pilot training for that. But they needed pilots, and I stayed in, and doggone it, I was determined I was going to make it through that class. And so when I got up, and I was flying for a while, and I would start feeling a little bit woozy, my flight instructor, who for the T-41 phase was a civilian instructor pilot, he knew what was coming, so he got out the airsick bag and handed it to me. He says, "I've got the airplane," and I went ahead and I took care of the business in the airsick bag, and I sealed it up, and I put it down in the leg pocket of my flight suit, and I said, "Okay, I've got the airplane," and it was over, and I was fine. And I don't know why it happened so many times. I guess my system just had to get used to the flying. But we had that many flights, and I even managed to solo. We went up one time, and he says, "Let's do some steep turns first, and if you're going to get airsick, get it out of the way." Well, on my solo flight, I never did get airsick. I guess I was too excited. But I did manage to solo in the airplane, and I passed a solo flight, and I never did fail a check ride in the T-41, so I guess they were pretty happy with my performance. We spent, I don't remember how long, it was between 1 and 3 months in the T-41. I think it's somewhere about 2 months. We didn't fly every day. Maybe it was about 45 days. But as I say, my memory is a little bit foggy just because of the time elapsed since that happened. But after we finished the T-41 flying, we moved into the T-37. Now, the T-37 is a twin-engine jet manufactured by Cessna, and it has side-by-side seating. Everybody said that the reason the instructor sat right beside the student pilot was so if the student pilot did something wrong, the instructor could lean over and whack him. I never heard of that happening, but it was a fun thing that we student pilots said. And we in the T-37, we did a lot of learning how to fly. On my very first flight in the T-37, Lieutenant Stevens, now he was a first lieutenant and I was a second lieutenant, who he was way ahead of me in rank. He turned to me and said, "I hear you got airsick in the T-41 a lot." I said, "Yeah, I did. But I didn't get airsick on my last flight." And we were out there flying. We were headed out to one of the training areas, like I had been assigning people in my pre-training radio days. He said, "Well, we'll just see about that." And he took the airplane and went, whoop, and the airplane turned over on its back. And he just flew it upside down for a few minutes. And here I am sitting in the student pilot seat, which is on the left side, and I'm looking at the ground straight over my head. And I said, "Wow, this is really cool." And you know what? I never got sick in an airplane again after that. And we did aerobatics training where you do loops and aileron rolls and chandelles and Immelmans and lazy eights and just you name it. And we learned how to do it in the T-37. It was a very good aerobatic airplane. Now, one of the things that we learned in the T-37 was spins. Now, I'm here to tell you, a spin in a T-37 is probably the most violent maneuver you will ever endure in an airplane. The way it worked was we would pull the airplane, we would have to be up at least 25,000 feet, I think. And we would pull the airplane up 20 degrees, nose up, and put the throttles to idle and let the speed decrease, because you're going uphill and you're not adding power. The speed would decrease and decrease and decrease until you started to get the burble when the airplane was just getting ready to fall out of the sky with a stall. And then you put in full rudder one way or the other. And a stall plus a yaw equals a spin. Now, the T-37 is a military airplane, and it's the only airplane that will stabilize in a spin. Civilian airplanes will not stabilize in a spin. Basically, if a civilian airplane gets into a spin, you just let go of everything, take your hands and feet off of the controls, and it will fly itself out of the spin. The T-37, no such luck. You have to learn to get out of the spin. Now, when the T-37 gets in a spin, it's basically falling out of the sky, and it's going around and around and around, 2 full revolutions per second. Now, the way you get out of a spin is you have to watch the terrain as it goes by, and it's going by 2 full revolutions per second, and the spin, you have to pick out a landmark on the horizon, and when it goes by, you stomp the opposite rudder to the direction of the spin, full opposite rudder, and wait until that landmark comes by again. And then when the landmark comes by again, you take the control yoke, which you've been holding all the way to the back, and you whap it against the forward stop, which basically makes the elevators go down and throws the tail up and puts the nose down and makes the airplane fly out of the spin. I did several of these spin training exercises, actually spin training recovery exercises, never had a problem with air sickness. And it's a maneuver that essentially teaches you as a pilot to maintain logical thought processes in the face of the most violent maneuvers of the airplane. They stopped spin training in the T-37 phase several years after I graduated pilot training, and they noticed that accidents began to increase in the Air Force, and so they put it back into the curriculum. I don't believe they have the T-37 in the Air Force UPT curriculum anymore. They have replaced it with the T-6 Texan, which is a single-engine turboprop. But that spin training was one of the best exercises and training elements of the UPT course that I believe they could do as far as teaching pilots how to maintain your equilibrium when everything around you seems to be going to the outhouse in a handbasket. Okay? That was, actually, it was fun. Also, in the T-37s, we began to learn formation flying. We never flew more than 2-ship formation in the T-37, but we did learn to do formation aerobatics. We did an aileron roll in formation. We did a barrel roll in formation. We would do a loop in formation. Now in the T-37, a loop is basically a horizontal 360-degree turn. And coming down the back of that loop, you're probably doing 300 knots, and you're pulling hard, and you're pulling probably between 3 and 4 G's as you're coming out of the bottom of that loop. And when you do this in formation, you're maybe pulling just a little bit more as the wingman. So it was very much fun, adventurous to be doing all these aerobatics, especially in formation in the T-37. Now we would spend, I think, about 4 months in that T-37, and then we would move on to the final phase of pilot training, which is the T-38. Now the T-38 is a twin-engine supersonic trainer with fore and aft seating, tandem seating. And I've had a video out on this already called Formation Flying and Zone Focus, and you can see a link to that video right here. If you haven't watched that video yet, you might want to go ahead and click that link and go watch it. It's a fun video. In any case, in the T-38s, we learned a lot more about flying. We learned how to control a very high-performance airplane such that when you just made a little bitty control input, the airplane would jump. The first time you fly formations in the T-38, lead is out there going smooth, and you're over here on the wing trying to maintain your position, and you put in a little input, and it goes, whoa, whoa, what was that? And you just have to learn to finesse the controls of that aircraft. And we learned how to utilize all of the classroom training we had been getting up to that time. The only classroom training and practical training that we had that we never did utilize, and I'm really glad about this, was parachute training and ejection seat training. Because the Air Force has a lot of airplanes with ejection seats, and almost all airplanes in the Air Force carry parachutes one way or another, we had to do a lot of parachute training, including the parachute landing fall, where you jumped off of a 6-foot tower into a sand pit and learned to fall and roll. And then You would do other things with parachute landing training and parachute training itself. They would get you in a parachute rig and tie you by a rope, a 300-foot long rope, to a deuce-and-a-half truck, and two instructors would lift up the parachute and you would start running, and the parachute would fill with wind and the truck would take off and you would go up in the air behind this truck, maybe 100 feet up in the air. And what they did was they would stop the truck and let you float down to the ground and then practice your parachute landing fall so you don't break your leg when you hit the ground from a real parachute descent. Now, they used to have the students, once they got up there, pull a slip knot on the rope, which would disconnect the rope, and they would not be tied to the Jeep, and they would just come down in the parachute and practice their parachute landing fall. Now, a parachute harness has two clips on the shoulder straps. These clips are called capos, C-A-P-O, capos, and these two clips fasten to the two main risers that go up to the parachute, such that when you land on the ground, if there's a wind that fills up the parachute and starts to drag you across the ground, you can release the capos, stick your thumbs in the wire loops and pull, and that disconnects you from the parachute. Well, there was one student in a class, several classes before mine, that was in his drag chute, his behind the truck training, and they said, "Get ready to release your rope." And instead of putting his hand on the rope, he undid the covers on his capos and put his thumbs in the wire rings. Now, if this student had pulled on those rings, he would have been totally disconnected from the parachute. He would have fallen from 100 feet in the air down onto the hard Laredo desert, and he probably would have killed himself. Fortunately, the instructors saw what was going on. They had a megaphone and they told him, "Freeze, do not pull, do not pull." And they stopped the truck and they let him just float down to the earth. But after that point, they made it so that students were not supposed to pull the rope to disconnect from the truck anymore. They just left the rope on and let him float down to the ground. And that was something that was really rather interesting to hear about. A lot of the regulations and procedures that are developed for the Air Force, for all military procedures, for commercial airlines, is things they have learned from tragedies or mistakes or accidents or crashing a vehicle, and they put procedures in place to prevent that from happening again. So that's one of the reasons I was really glad that they had these procedures. But in formation flying, in the video that I showed you that link for a few minutes ago, this was one of the days when everything went perfect, and I was just so happy to have had that day. And we got through pilot training and we graduated. And I have one more thing to tell you. When you solo in the T-41, it was no big deal. Everybody, yeah, good job, you did a solo, yeah. In the T-37, they would fly out to the auxiliary airfield called Barfly, and if you haven't seen the video on the great Barfly rabbit hunt, there's a link to it right there, and you can watch it if you wish. But we would fly out to the auxiliary airfield, which was called Barfly, and we would do several touch and goes in the pattern with the IP, and then the IP would say, okay, taxi over to the RSU, that's the runway supervisory unit, and we would open the canopy and the instructor would get out and he'd say, go fly 3 landings and come back and pick me up. And that was your solo. And once you soloed, you would go back to the main Air Force base, and afterwards you'd go into the squadron, and everybody in the squadron would cheer, yay, you had a solo. And then all the other students would gather around you, and they would pick you up by the arms, and they would cart you outside where there was this, about foot-deep kiddie pool filled with water, and they would throw you in the water. And that was your baptism into solo flight in the T-37. In the T-38s, they had the same thing. They had a different kiddie pool out, but they would carry you outside and throw you in the water, whether you wanted to go or not. You got thrown in the water. So when you came back from flying your solo, you had to be really careful to get everything out of your pocket. So if you didn't want it to get wet, you took it out of your pocket and you kind of left it on the desk, and then they would grab you and throw you in the pool. That was one of the celebrations we had for soloing in the T-37 and the T-38. And that's the outline of what happened at pilot training. Now, if anybody is watching this who went through Air Force undergraduate pilot training, UPT, and you remember things different than what I said, I would love to hear about them. You can leave them in a comment in the comment section down below. If you have comments on what I've said here, leave it in a comment in the comment section down below. As always, if you thought this video was a fun video and worth sharing with other people and letting the YouTube robots recommend it to others, give me that thumbs up, and YouTube will know that you thought it was good, and I will know and be encouraged to make more of these videos. As always, I appreciate everybody who has subscribed to this channel. If you're not already a subscriber, why not go ahead right now, click that subscribe button and then the bell icon so YouTube will let you know when I post another video right here on the David's Tutorials channel and vlog. In the meantime, have yourself a wonderful rest of your day and week and month, and take care. I'll see you in the next video.